Blockbuster was not renting movies. It was monetizing friction. The trip to the store, the return deadline, the late fee, the cost of being late. What looked like a simple entertainment business was built around something else. The friction was not sitting outside the model, it was part of the model. And once you see that, this stops being a story about movies. It becomes a story about what happens when a system depends on making access harder than it needs to be. To get the movie, you had to go where the movie was. To choose, you had to depend on what was left on the shelf. To keep it, you had to watch the clock. And to finish the experience, you had to go back to where it began. The process looked ordinary, but it was built on dependency, location, inventory, timing, return. Nothing moved unless the user moved with it. But the friction did more than slow the user down. It helped hold the model together. The late fee was not a side effect. It was part of the logic. Delay had a price. Missing the return had a cost. And inconvenience did not sit outside the business. It helped sustain the business. That is what made the system stronger than it looked. And that is also what made it fragile. Because once friction becomes part of the revenue logic, removing friction stops being an improvement. It becomes a threat. But the pressure was already shifting. The problem was no longer just friction. It was what friction had started to mean. The trip began to feel unnecessary. The deadline began to feel punitive. The inconvenience began to feel harder to justify. What people had once accepted as normal started to feel like a burden. What had once felt like part of the experience started to feel like something the user should no longer have to carry. And that is when the system begins to weaken. Not when a new technology appears. Not when a new company arrives. But when the old cost stops feeling legitimate. Netflix entered with a different relationship to the user. It did not ask the user to go where the inventory was. It moved access closer to the user. The choice was no longer trapped inside a local shelf. Return was no longer tied to the same urgency, and the experience no longer depended on the same points of friction. That is what made the system different. Not because it was newer, not because it was digital, but because it was built to remove what the old system had learned to depend on. That is when the collision became unavoidable. The moment convenience became the expectation, Blockbuster's revenue model became a liability. Because the friction was no longer just part of the experience, it was part of the business. And that meant the old system could not fully remove it without weakening itself. Blockbuster did not lose because Netflix was newer. It lost because it depended on friction the market had already started to reject. At that point, adaptation was no longer enough. The system was being asked to give up what had once helped hold it together. What the old system had normalized, the new system turned into leverage. Every avoided trip, every reduced deadline, every removed penalty. The pressure did not disappear. It changed sides. What Blockbuster had placed on the user became the opening Netflix built around. That is how the market reorganized. Systems that monetize friction do not die when a new brand appears. They die when friction itself stops feeling legitimate. As long as the burden feels normal, the system can look stable, sometimes even dominant. But the moment that burden starts to feel unnecessary, the structure begins to give way. This is what happens when a system is built on a cost the user no longer accepts as normal. The form changes. The mechanism does not. It appears anywhere a system survives by asking the user to carry a cost that no longer feels justified. The pattern is always there.